Today we will explore an often overlooked aspect of medieval history, the daily life of peasants and their forms of entertainment during the Middle Ages. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this. Imagine a world without the constant hum of electricity, without the distant noise of traffic, without the ambient music that fills every commercial establishment of modern times. Imagine waking up before dawn and hearing only the singing of birds, the distant lowing of cattle, and the wind passing through the wheat fields. This was the world of medieval peasants, a sound universe radically different from ours, where silence was not the exception, but the rule. And it is precisely in this silence that our journey begins, for it was within it that one of the deepest appreciations for music that humanity has ever known was born. Historians often portray medieval life as an existence of constant suffering, hard labor, and uninterrupted misery. Cinematic representations show us dirty, hungry, and oppressed peasants, dragging themselves through the fields under the weight of their feudal obligations. But this image, although it contains true elements, is far from capturing the totality of the human experience in that period. The truth is considerably more complex and, in many aspects, surprisingly vibrant. The men and women who worked the land in 14th century England, for example, did not merely survive, but found the time and inclination to laugh, sing, dance, and celebrate life in ways that we may have forgotten in our era of instant entertainment and perpetual distraction. To truly understand how medieval peasants enjoyed themselves, we must first understand the context in which they lived. Medieval society was organized around three fundamental pillars: the church, the nobility, and the workers of the land. Each group had its defined role, its responsibilities, and, crucially, its own rituals and forms of celebration. The medieval calendar was punctuated by dozens of holy days, seasonal festivals, and local celebrations that offered common workers the opportunity to set aside their tools and participate in recreational activities. It is estimated that there were between 40 and 50 holy days per year, in addition to Sundays, during which work was prohibited or significantly reduced. These were not days of passive rest, but occasions for community gatherings, festivities, and diversions of all kinds. Music occupied a central place in this universe of entertainment. To understand its importance, we must first mentally transport ourselves to a world without amplifiers, without recordings, without the sonic omnipresence that characterizes our contemporary existence. When a musician played in a medieval village, the event possessed an almost sacred quality. The notes of a flute or the chords of a harp broke the daily silence in a way that we simply cannot reproduce in our sound-saturated era. It was as if the music created a space apart, a moment suspended in time where the worries of day-to-day life could be momentarily forgotten. Feudal lords understood the power of music well and kept musicians in their courts as symbols of prestige and as a source of entertainment for banquets and celebrations. Some wealthier nobles went as far as employing hundreds of musicians, creating true orchestras that accompanied all the important events of their houses. But music was not the exclusive privilege of the aristocracy. In the hamlets and villages, the musical tradition flourished in its own ways, adapted to the realities of rural life. Shepherds, for example, were known for their musical skill. Spending long solitary hours in the fields with their flocks, they developed an intimate relationship with simple instruments like wooden flutes and whistles. The sound of a shepherd playing his flute at dusk was a familiar presence in the medieval soundscape, a melody that accompanied the rhythm of the seasons and the cycle of agricultural life. Other village inhabitants also cultivated musical talents, and it was common to find improvised musicians in the streets, playing for neighbors and passers-by in exchange for a few coins, or simply for the pleasure of sharing their art. There were, however, special moments when music took on an even more prominent role in community life. Brewing Day was one of those moments. Beer was much more than a drink in medieval society. It was a basic necessity, a source of nutrition and hydration in an age when drinking water was not always reliable. When the time came to prepare a new batch, the local tavern transformed into a center of social coexistence. All the musicians of the region were expected to gather there, turning a day of collective labor into an improvised celebration. Amidst the aromatic vapors of malt and hops, melodies intertwined with conversation and laughter, creating an atmosphere of camaraderie that strengthened community bonds. Where there was music, there was inevitably dance. Medieval peasants were enthusiastic dancers, and dance served as one of the primary forms of social and physical expression. A particularly popular form was what was called caroling, a circular dance that had nothing to do with the modern practice of singing Christmas songs from door to door. In medieval caroling, participants held hands or arms and formed a circle around a leader, moving together while singing songs that often had bold or humorous lyrics. It was a democratic form of entertainment, requiring no special skills or expensive equipment, only the willingness to join the group and participate in the collective joy. The tradition of medieval dance was enriched by the presence of itinerant performers known as minstrels. These entertainment professionals traveled from village to village, from castle to castle, bringing with them not only music, but an entire visual spectacle. Groups of minstrels often included acrobats and jugglers who impressed audiences with feats of physical dexterity that seemed to defy the laws of nature. There were performers who executed pirouettes on the tips of swords, maintaining balance in positions that made the audience hold their breath. Others performed elaborate dances that combined grace and sensuality, offering a type of visual entertainment that captured the imagination and fed the dreams of people whose lives were, to a large extent, circumscribed by the limits of their villages. Theatre also occupied a prominent place among the forms of entertainment accessible to the common people. Theatrical companies that established themselves in larger cities offered plays that addressed a variety of themes, from religious dramas that retold biblical stories to comedies that satirized the authorities and customs of the time. Medieval theatre was a mirror where society could see itself reflected, sometimes in an edifying way, other times in a critical and irreverent manner. For the peasants who managed to watch these performances, it was an opportunity to momentarily escape daily worries and immerse themselves in worlds of fantasy and reflection. But perhaps no form of entertainment captured the popular imagination with as much intensity as jousts. These tournaments of mounted combat were much more than simple sporting competitions. They were grand spectacles that embodied the ideals of chivalry and martial prowess. For the peasants who crowded the stands or the fences around the arena, jousts offered something extraordinary, the opportunity to see the most privileged members of society risking their lives for public entertainment. There were the lords, the knights, the men who normally represented authority and inaccessible power, submitting themselves to the judgment of luck and skill, vulnerable as any mortal to the impact of a well-aimed lance. There was a kind of temporary leveling in this, a symbolic inversion of the social hierarchy that made the spectacle irresistibly attractive to the lower classes. Medieval tournaments were carefully organized events that could last several days and attracted crowds from all social classes. In addition to the jousts themselves, there were foot combat competitions, demonstrations of skill with weapons, and all sorts of parallel activities. Merchants took advantage of the occasion to sell their products, street performers sought to earn a few coins, and the general atmosphere was one of celebration and excitement. For many peasants, a visit to a tournament was one of the highlights of the year, an experience that would be remembered and discussed for months. It was not necessary, however, to wait for grand events to find fun. The daily life of medieval villages was permeated with games and competitions that offered regular and accessible entertainment. Children ran through the streets playing variations of tag. That would not be very different from the childhood games of any era. Adults had their own diversions, many of which involved demonstrations of strength and physical skill. Wrestling was particularly popular, especially during fairs and festivals, where local competitors could measure their strength in friendly bouts that attracted enthusiastic supporters. There were also forms of entertainment that, to the modern sensibility, seem cruel and disturbing. Bull and bear baiting, for example, was a common spectacle in which animals were tied to stakes and attacked by dogs trained for that purpose. Cockfights attracted eager bettors who cheered and shouted as the birds faced each other in mortal combat. These events remind us that the relationship between humans and animals was fundamentally different in the Middle Ages, shaped by survival needs and a worldview in which animal suffering did not carry the same moral weight we attribute to it today. It is not for us to judge these practices by contemporary standards, but to recognize that they were an integral part of the medieval social fabric. Among all the games and sports practiced by medieval peasants, one stands out for its enduring popularity and its connection to the most watched sport in the modern world, football. Medieval football, however, bore little resemblance to the organized game we know today. It was, in essence, a kind of collective combat that took place in the streets and fields of the villages, with teams that could include dozens or even hundreds of participants on each side. Rules were minimal, the boundaries of the field were often non-existent, and violence was an accepted part of the game. The ball, made of an inflated pig's bladder and wrapped in leather, was contested with a ferocity that regularly resulted in serious injuries. Games could last for hours and extend over great distances, with participants chasing the ball through fields, streams, and even inside houses if necessary. Medieval authorities looked upon football with a mixture of disapproval and alarm. The clergy considered it a vulgar and potentially sinful distraction, while the nobility worried about the possibility that these chaotic encounters could turn into pretexts for riots and revolts. There were several attempts to ban or restrict the game, but the popularity of football among the working classes proved to be resistant to all prohibitions. It was a sport that required no expensive equipment or special fields, just a ball, a group of willing participants, and a good amount of energy to spend. Other outdoor games also occupied the peasants' free time. There were variations of bowling that were played on lawns or improvised lanes, with wooden balls being thrown toward targets or pins. Games combining elements of what we now know as hockey and tennis were practiced with sticks and balls in open fields. These activities offered not only entertainment, but also opportunities for socialization, friendly competition, and occasionally bets that added an extra layer of excitement to the games. Among all the sports and games practiced in medieval England, the practice of archery occupied a singular position. The English longbow was a devastating weapon of war, and the skill of English archers had proven decisive in battles such as Crécy and Poitiers. The Crown had a direct interest in maintaining a population of trained archers, and therefore the practice of the bow was not only permitted, but actively encouraged among the peasants. At a certain point in the 14th century, it reached the point of banning all other sports for common men, in an attempt to ensure they dedicated their free time to perfecting their skills with the bow. This extreme measure reflected both the military importance of the bow and the authorities' concern with what they considered degenerate activities that caused disorder. When the weather or inclination did not favor outdoor activities, medieval peasants had a variety of indoor games at their disposal. Dice games were extremely popular, offering a combination of luck, excitement, and the possibility of financial gains that made them irresistible to many. Betting was an integral part of the culture of dice games, and taverns frequently served as gambling venues where modest fortunes could change hands over the course of a night. Coin tossing. Games also attracted bettors, with participants trying their luck at simple games that required little explanation and no equipment beyond a few coins. It is important to note, however, that these activities were not universally accepted. The medieval clergy looked upon games of chance with suspicion and frequently condemned them as sinful. Secular authorities also had their reservations, worried about the possibility that losses in gambling would lead to conflicts, debts, and other social problems. Dice players, therefore, often operated on the margins of respectability, seeking their pleasures in spaces where moral surveillance was less intense. Card games, which would come to dominate tabletop entertainment in later centuries, had a relatively limited presence in medieval England, at least until the 15th and 16th centuries. France had developed a card-making industry as early as the 14th century, but the spread of this pastime across the English Channel was gradual. When cards finally became popular in England, they brought with them new possibilities for play and socialization that would complement existing traditions. Board games, in turn, had a long history in medieval Europe and offered entertainment that combined strategy, competition, and social interaction. Chess was perhaps the most prestigious of these games, although its association with the nobility and the need to know complex rules made it less common among peasants. Games like backgammon and checkers were more accessible, with simpler rules and equipment that could be improvised when necessary. The game known as Nine Men's Morris was particularly popular, played on boards that could be drawn on the ground or carved into stone, with pieces that could be simple pebbles or seeds. These board games served as focuses for social interaction, bringing people together around a table or an improvised board for moments of friendly competition. They were activities that could be enjoyed during the long winter nights, when work in the fields was impossible and families withdrew to the warmth of their hearths. The game board created a space of temporary equality where skill and luck mattered more than social status, offering participants a way to exercise their minds while enjoying each other's company. Literature and storytelling represented another important dimension of medieval entertainment, though in a very different form from what we understand as literature today. Books were rare and valuable objects, produced by hand by copyists in a laborious and expensive process. The possession of books was the almost exclusive privilege of the nobility, the clergy, and religious institutions. But this did not mean that peasants were completely excluded from the world of written words. An interesting practice that connected the illiterate to the world of literature was community readings. On these occasions, a literate person, often someone of higher social standing or a member of the clergy, gathered an audience to read aloud from a manuscript. These readings had more in common with theatrical performances than with our modern notion of silent and individual reading. The reader lent his voice to the words, dramatizing passages, modulating the tone to create tension or humor, transforming the text into a shared and living experience. For the listeners, it was an opportunity to access stories, knowledge, and entertainment that would otherwise remain inaccessible. Even more widespread was the oral tradition of storytelling. In a culture where most people could not read or write, memory and the voice were the primary vehicles of cultural transmission. Storytellers occupied a special role in communities, preserving and transmitting narratives that could date back generations. Around bonfires, in taverns, during family gatherings, these stories came to life through the words of skilled narrators who knew how to capture the attention of their audiences. There were tales of heroes and villains, stories of love and betrayal, legends of saints and demons, fables that taught moral lessons, and jokes that provoked laughter. Storytelling was an art that anyone could practice and everyone could appreciate, a truly democratic form of entertainment that connected people through the universal power of narrative. Seasonal festivals and celebrations offered special moments in the medieval calendar, where all these forms of entertainment could combine into larger celebrations. The change of seasons was marked by rituals and feasts that had both Christian and pagan roots, creating an annual cycle of celebrations that punctuated the passage of time. Each season brought its own characteristics and possibilities for celebration. Autumn, for example, was a period of relative abundance, when the harvests were being gathered and there was more food available than at other times of the year. Fruits were at the peak of their freshness, and meat was more abundant because many animals were slaughtered before winter, when the cost of feeding them became prohibitive. Harvest festivals celebrated this temporary abundance with community banquets where people could eat and drink with a generosity that would be impossible during leaner months. The medieval diet was governed not only by the availability of food, but also by strict religious rules. The Church prohibited the consumption of meat on specific days of the week and during extended periods, such as Lent and Advent. Adding up all these days of abstinence, more than half the year was dedicated to meatless diets. These restrictions were taken seriously by people of all social classes, from the humblest peasants to kings, as disobeying them meant risking eternal damnation and, more immediately, the social censure of neighbors and ecclesiastical authorities. Fish, which did not count as meat for religious purposes, might seem like an obvious alternative for fast days. But the logistics of transporting fresh fish from coastal regions to rural inland areas presented considerable challenges. Without refrigeration, fish deteriorated rapidly, and the time required to travel medieval roads meant that for many inland communities, fresh fish was a rare luxury. The winter months presented additional difficulties, with rougher seas making fishing harder and shorter days, reducing the time available to transport catches inland. These dietary restrictions gave festivals additional meaning. The days when meat was permitted became special occasions, moments when people could savor foods that were forbidden for much of the year. The contrast between periods of fasting and festive occasions intensified the pleasure of the celebration, making each banquet a more valuable and memorable experience. As we examine this entire panorama of medieval entertainment, what emerges is a very different image from the stereotype of constant misery and oppression. The peasants of the Middle Ages certainly faced difficulties that would be unimaginable to most of us today. Work was hard, life was often short, and the uncertainties of nature and politics could bring sudden disasters. But within these limitations, people found ways to celebrate life, to laugh together, to create moments of beauty and joy that made existence more bearable and sometimes genuinely pleasurable. The music that broke the silence of the fields, the circular dances at fairs, the performances of minstrels, the excitement of jousts, the camaraderie of games, the stories told around the fire. All of this was part of a rich tapestry of human experiences that should not be forgotten or underestimated. Medieval peasants were not just silent and suffering workers, they were complete people, with needs for fun and social connection that found expression in creative and community forms. There is something to be learned from this ability to find joy in difficult circumstances, to create entertainment with minimal resources, to value music and dance and human company in a world devoid of the technological distractions that today fill every moment of our time. Medieval peasants remind us that entertainment does not need to be expensive or sophisticated to be meaningful, that the community can be both the stage and the audience, and that laughter is a fundamental human need that finds its way through all barriers of time and circumstance. If this journey through the world of medieval entertainment has captured your imagination and sparked your interest in history, consider this an invitation to continue exploring with us. Every era of human history holds treasures of experience and wisdom that can enrich our understanding of the present. If you enjoyed this narrative, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journeys through time. Leave your comment sharing which aspect of medieval life most surprised or intrigued you, and don't forget to like this video so that more people can discover the fascinating stories the past has to tell us. Until the next journey through history.